Okay, so welcome everybody to the first Critical Antiquities Workshop for the second half of 2024. Particular shout out to anyone in the audience who's tuning in the late hours of the evening. I think it might just be Ben and I, so I'm just going to publicly give kudos to Ben and I for being here, and Anthony being here at 11 p.m. But there's nowhere else we'd rather be. I'm going to first up acknowledge the country of the universities that Ben and I work at, country of the original inhabitants of these places. So the University of Sydney and the University of Wollongong are situated on Gadigal country and on the country of the Yuin, Wadi and Darawal peoples, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. The lands of these and other Indigenous peoples in Australia were stolen, of course. Their sovereignty has never been ceded, and colonialism continues to display its devastating effects on First Nations people across this continent. We mourn this and we commit ourselves to truth-telling, education, and praxis where possible in order that some good may yet come. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce Melissa Lane, who'll be speaking to us about her book first. But before I do, I'll just give everyone an idea of the format for today. So after Melissa's introduced her book, we'll be hearing from our two wonderful respondents. First will be Demetra Kasimis and then Anthony Hooper. Both of them will have about 10 minutes. Then we'll give Melissa a chance to reply, about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion for audience Q&A. So Melissa Lane, well, I could spend almost the next 90 minutes just introducing Melissa and trying to narrate and do justice to her accomplishments, but I'm gonna make this the barest of highlights reels because I sense that a lot of us would rather delve into this wonderful book. So Melissa Lane is, of course, class of 1943 professor of politics at Princeton University. Until recently, she was director of the University Centre for Human Values, a position she held for a heroic 8 years. Before coming to Princeton, Melissa taught political thought for 15 years in the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge, where she was also a Fellow of King's College and Associate Director of the college's Centre for History and Economics. As likely you all know, Melissa is a specialist of ancient political thought, but that certainly understates the depth of her knowledge of the history of political thought. Melissa has also made significant contributions to the history of modern political thought, and Melissa especially evinces something that many historians of ancient political thought experience. They tend to be drawn into conversation with anyone who is engaged or indeed wants to engage with ancient political thought, and that ends up meaning a whole lot of people. More than that, Melissa has done substantial research on the ethics and political theory of climate change while drawing deftly on the tradition of ancient political thought. So the standout work here is, of course, her book Eco Republic, first published in the UK in 2011. But more narrowly, in the vein of ancient Greek political thought, I'll single out Melissa's major contributions. So there are her monographs, Method and Politics in Plato's Statesman, published by Cambridge in 1998, Plato's Progeny, How Plato and Socrates Still Captivate the Modern Mind, published by Duckworth in 2001, Greek and Roman Political Ideas, which appeared as a Penguin Pelican in the UK and Commonwealth in 2014, and then updated and republished in the United States as The Birth of Politics, 8 Greek and Roman Political Ideas and Why They Matter, which was published by Princeton in 2015. And then she has a co-edited book with Verity Hart, Politeia in Greek and Roman Philosophy, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013. And of course, among her extensive articles and book chapters, noteworthy are the introduction to the Penguin Classics edition of Desmond Lee's translation of Plato's Republic, and her article, revised and updated many times, Ancient Political Philosophy for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And then, of course, there's the book that's the focus of today, Of Rule and Office, Plato's Ideas of the Political, which was published by Princeton University Press last year, and which stems from a series of 6 talks she gave as the Carlyle Lecturer at the University of Oxford in 2018. So without further ado, welcome Melissa, and I invite everybody to join me in welcoming warmly Melissa Lane.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tristan, for that really generous introduction, and to you and Ben for the invitation to hold this event, and you and Ben and Anthony and anyone else who's joining so late in the evening. And of course, to Anthony and Demi for agreeing to serve as commentators on what is a long and complex book. So I want to introduce it starting with Malcolm Schofield's description of it as a constitutionalist reading of Plato's political thought. And in presenting here, I'm going to be drawing on my response to another set of comments that will be appearing soon in a book symposium in the journal Polis. And there are other symposia either forthcoming or already published in various places. So the goodness and badness of constitutions is structured in Plato, as in classical Greek thought and practice more generally, through the linked ideas of rule and office. So office, in my use, is a kind of rule. And the book hinges on the fact that the more specific idea of office, and I'll explain in a moment what I mean, was focally expressed in the very same vocabulary as the more generic idea of rule. So in particular, the noun arche and the verb archein, both are translated in many different contexts, sometimes specifically as office, and by office, I mean a position characterized by limited political powers, powers that are limited and controlled in some way. Whereas rule is the more generic idea, and it could be organized in multiple ways, ranging from untrammeled sole power to multiple positions of office that are each characterized by limited political powers. So whenever we interpret texts and inscriptions from classical Greece, we have to be alert to these two related senses of the same vocabulary. And sometimes, as I show in the book, there are contextual or syntactical clues that give us a sense of whether what's at stake in any given passage is a more general idea of rule or the specific idea of office. So, for example, in Plato's Critias, Plato's character Critias describes the constitution of archaic Atlantis as characterized by ton archon kai timon, Critias 119c1. Various clues there, including the plural of both nouns, signal that offices is the best translation to capture the sense of ton archon. So the offices and the more general civic honors and offices in many Greek cities are a subclass of these more general roles of civic honor. So what I argue in the book is that Plato's use of the vocabulary of arche and archein we can think of it as a fact hiding in plain sight, because actually many translators, even of the Republic, are sensitive to the fact that in crucial passages of the Republic, including in the high points of the discussion of the Kallipolis in books 5 through 7, Plato actually uses the vocabulary in ways that signal unmistakably offices. So the use of the plural, the use of certain prepositional phrases, and many translators in many languages, including French, Spanish, German, Italian. Since publishing the book, I learned also Russian and Korean and other languages, pick this up correctly, but we've said very little about what it means that there is the vocabulary of office at the heart of the description of the Kallipolis. So that's one part of what my book tries to understand in its 5 chapters on the Republic, as well as a chapter each on the laws and the statesmen, and 4 thematic chapters. It tries to understand what Plato is doing in making use of the vocabulary of office, both in the Republic and the statesmen, where we might least expect it, as well as, of course, in the laws, where it's been much more widely acknowledged and discussed. But thematically, once we have this distinction between rule and office, we can ask, did Plato hold that good constitutions are all alike, while every bad constitution is bad in its own way? So this is one way of thinking about the question of Plato as a constitutionalist thinker. And so the answer that I develop in the book to each clause of that question is both yes and no. And here I follow Andre's characteristic turns of phrase, where he has often said both yes and no to things, and I've picked up this habit from him. So yes, to good constitutions being all alike, in the sense that all good constitutions are characterized by a taxis, an order that is sufficiently adequate to achieve the telos of rule. So this is the other pair of terms on which my study depends and around which it revolves: a taxis, an order, which is adequate to achieve the telos of rule. And I take the telos of rule in Plato to be the good of the ruled. And this is a purpose which I find Plato to have assumed in common with a wide range of archaic and classical Greek sources. So in my view, the idea that rule should aim at the good of the ruled is not a sort of weird fetish of Platonic idealism. It's actually the kind of background norm, of course, often honored in the breach, both in text and in practice, but nevertheless, the background norm that Plato shares. So in that sense, all good constitutions are alike. They all have a taxis oriented to achieving that telos, but they're also not alike because they can, while all being good in that fundamental way, they can still be very different from one another. And so I construe the diverse political models in each of the three dialogues in which I focus as building on this vocabulary and these roles endemic to Greek constitutional practices, but reconfiguring those roles in different ways to try out different ways in which the taxis can secure the telos of the good of the ruled. And so notoriously, I read the dialogues backwards. So I start with a chapter on the laws, then a chapter on the statesman, and then 5 chapters on the republic. And I do that because I think that showing Plato's unquestioned sensitivity to the vocabulary and the roles of rule and offices in the laws helps to sensitize us to expecting that the same vocabulary and a concern with the reconfiguration of those roles will also be found in the statesman and republic, as indeed they are. So in sum, to give a very brief summary of how I read the 3 dialogues, the laws features office holders whose roles are relatively close to those in existing constitutions, but the laws themselves are reshaped, and there's a special body to safeguard the spirit of the laws. The statesman, too, features offices and laws, although in the Constitution that's governed by the true statesman, we get only a very brief, but I argue unmistakable reference to offices at the very end of the dialogue. But it pays most attention to the superordinate ruling role of the statesman king. And the Republic casts as superordinate rulers a group of reigning philosopher kings and queens who rise to those roles through the ranks of serving as auxiliaries and then as apprentice rulers. And at one crucial moment in Book 5, the position of those apprentice rulers when the apprentices go back into the cave to rule from the ages of 35 to 50, their positions are characterized in the Greek vocabulary of offices. So we have unmistakable reference to offices at the heart of the Callipolis. But while all good constitutions then are alike in having a taxis that's adequate to secure the telos, and bad constitutions are also alike in failing to meet that standard. But of course, in another sense, all bad constitutions are bad in their own way. And so 2 of my chapters treat the bad constitutions of city and soul that we find in books 8 and 9 of the Republic. Now, my focus is on political rule. So the title of the book is Of Rule and Office, Plato's Ideas of the Political. But of course, Plato's idea of rule is broader than simply political rule. And so my analysis applies also to other domains of rule, including the psychological and the theological. The key is that in each case, there has to be a role of ruler, and ruling has to be inherently ordered if it is to be able to perform its ordering role. That's a quotation from page 350 of the book. So I would be happy to say more about how my analysis applies to psychological rule. The special challenge of political rule is that because the role of ruler has to be occupied by a being, an entity, whether a soul part or, well, in the case of political rule, an actual person, whether mortal or divine, there's always the possibility in principle that the good of that person who's occupying the role of political rule could come apart from the good of the ruled. So I think political rule has a kind of special sort of problematic status for Plato, and that's why I think it's worth studying it in depth and it's on its own terms, even though the structure of rule is common to all of these different domains. So let me just close with a few words about what I think is important about reading Plato as a constitutionalist thinker, as I try to do. So in a way, to say that Plato is a constitutionalist throughout his political thought shouldn't be so surprising when we think about the Greek title of the Republic, of course, being politeia, and the Greek titles of the statesmen and the laws being politikos and nomoi. But because the Republic has so seldom been read in this light, I had to devote far more chapters to making the case for the Republic. I had, in a way, one could have devoted an equal number of chapters to the Statesman, but I'd already published quite a few papers on the Statesman, which I tried to condense into the chapter in the book. So there's more to say about the Statesman in this light that you can find in other works that I had separately published. And so in doing this, I want to argue that contrary to traditions which have taken the Republic to be only secondarily about politics, or those who have claimed, even Malcolm Schofield, who famously claimed that the Republic had relatively little to say about political rule, and he also said that about the statesmen. I want to argue that the three dialogues are equally penetrating and sophisticated in their analyses of political rule. And so broadly speaking, I put myself in the same lineage as Andre Lax and Dimitri Elmer, who take up a complementarian approach to the three dialogues in this way. And so let me finally say something more substantive about the claim that the Republic in particular is engaged in a constitutional project. So the question here is, in what way are limits actually active in the constitutional project of the Callipolis? And the chapter that was circulated, the two chapters that were circulated, the introduction and then chapter 6 of the book, focuses on one set of limits, which is the paying of wages in the Callipolis, which I take very seriously, as you will have seen. And I think that in different ways, both of our commentators are going to focus on that. But I thought I would therefore conclude these comments by saying a bit more about how more broadly I understand limits, control, and what I call a functional equivalent to accountability in the taxis of rule in the Callipolis of the Republic. And so here I draw also on especially chapters 5 and 7 of the book. So the idea here is that, well, it's really twofold. One is that there are important limits that are imposed by law, as we see explicitly said at the end of book 3. This is where wages are imposed, but also the deprivation of family life, which will be, of course, expanded and explained further in book 5. But already in book 3, the deprivation of the ability to amass property, the deprivation of privacy in the household, with treasuries and storerooms having to be open to all. And so all of those restrictions are imposed by law, and those laws are to be safeguarded by the highest rulers, none of whom get to be self-authorizing. So it's important to my reading that every cohort of rulers in the Republic has to be tested and ultimately authorized by their predecessors. So there's no sort of self-authorizing of any particular cohort. And if you then say, well, how is the highest cohort to be held accountable? So the lower cohorts, including the office holders, those between the ages of 35 and 50, are held accountable by their superiors. And if we then ask the sort of juvenile question, which I call the juvenile conundrum, well, who will guard those guardians, who will guard the highest guardians, those over the age of 50? Well, this is where I come to the root meaning of accountability as actually lying in the giving and taking of reasons. And so actually, as I argue in the book, giving an account, didonai logon, is central in Greek practices of financial oversight. That's the term that's used where the accounts in practice were originally financial. In Athens, that expands to giving an account in the euthunai of all of one's actions, potentially, as an office holder. But that same idea, didonai logon, the same phrase, is central to the practice of the philosopher rulers in the Republic. And so substantively, the knowledge that the philosopher rulers have is what enables them to actually engage in this functional equivalent of accountability through this continuous testing and scrutiny, through these practices, through themselves being subject to these laws, which include the law of being paid wages, which we'll discuss. Now, as I argue in the book, it's not at all clear that any of the models, whether this model of the Kallipolis or the models that we find in the Statesmen and the Laws, will be kind of ultimately or permanently successful. We know Plato tells us in Book 8 of the Republic that the Kallipolis will not last forever. But I would argue that also liberal democratic constitutions today, those models also have their own Achilles heel and actually have a challenge of ultimately answering the juvenile conundrum. And so my claim is not that Plato's models are the ultimate answer, but that they help us to understand what's at stake in trying to safeguard rule so that in any constitution we can answer the question of who will guard the guardians. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Melissa. So I will now introduce our next speaker. So Demetra Kasimis is currently Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and an associated faculty member of the Department of Classics, a member of the affiliated faculty and board of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and a fellow of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. But as of September, she will be assistant professor in Polis at the University of Cambridge. So congratulations to Demi for that. And Demi teaches and researches in democratic theory in the most exciting way, I think. She brings deep learning and careful readings of ancient political thought together with contemporary political theory and political practices, especially in the critical tradition of continental political thought. Testimony to this is the fact that she was an editor for the ancient political thought journal Polis and is now an editor for the journal Contemporary Political Theory. I think she has to be one of the only people to have ever taken two roles quite like that. This multi-temporal approach and her interest in what makes a productive engagement with antiquity is on display across all her work and makes it particularly fitting for the Critical Antiquities Workshop. If that speaks to the form or the methodologies of her approach to democratic theory, substantively, Demi is especially interested in problems of migration and political membership, gender and kinship, democratic instability and conspiracy, and interpretive method. Demi holds a BA and MA from Columbia University, where she studied philosophy and Hellenic studies, and a PhD in political science from Northwestern University. Her research has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council for Learned Societies, the Mellon Foundation, and the Fulbright Foundation. So thank you to Demi for being here, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. That was a really kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be part of this discussion of and celebration of Melissa's work and her latest book. I want to thank Tristan and Ben for inviting me to be part of this, and it's great to meet Anthony and to see all of you. So I'm going to start with very, very brief general comments on the book so that I can then focus on, as Melissa already mentioned, some of the lines of argumentation running through chapter 6 and wages, and then that can hopefully take us into a broader conversation about some of those sort of central democratic problems that Melissa is interested in and really underscored in the last few things that she said just now. So in Of Rule and Office, Melissa Lane pays careful attention to the different yet what she calls interlocking notions of rule and office, as you've already heard. These get fused in the single word arche and its various forms in ancient Greek. One effect of this focus in the book is that she can foreground accountability as a primary problem for collective life. In a series of rich readings of the Statesman, the Republic, and the Laws, Plato turns out to be writing creatively, tracking the question of how to keep rulers focused on the good of the ruled, or Melissa is focused on tracking that. But to clear the way for this line of inquiry, she must unsettle the common assumption that arche connotes exclusively a practice of absolute rule in Plato's works. And she persuasively does this by showing the reader how arche connotes an additional sort, a kind of subcategory of ruling that is akin to office holding. And so in over 11 chapters of Office and Rule makes clear that ignorance of or indifference to the polysemy of arche, at least in the office holding sense, has made it difficult for us to enlist Plato as fully as we might want to in thinking critically about the corruption or instability that threatens any constitutional project. But this prying apart of arche leads Melissa Lane into more and possibly more fertile territory than my conventional description of the book suggests. Since its publication, reviewers have understandably tended to concentrate on the issues of rule and office holding. But what risks getting lost in these engagements are the fresh accounts that she gives of much studied problems of wealth and regime change in the Republic in particular, and that's going to be my focus. And so one of the pleasures of reading this book was getting to see how she focuses her interpretive lens on textual details in order to open very familiar big picture arguments in Plato's text to new interpretive possibilities. And I'm going to look at one of these, which is the discussion of wages for rulers, the subject of chapter 6, to illustrate how the office orientation of the book might help us think through broader economic or oikonomic concerns, not only in Plato's thought, but also as far as Athenian democracy is concerned, or even contemporary democracy, if we want to take that up in our discussion. So for Plato, according to Melissa Lane, the guardian's rule aims at the good of the ruled. This is a problem in the dialogue. If the telos of rule benefits, quote, others, the ruled, rather than the rule holder themselves, rule holder themselves, it is not clear why a natural person fit to rule would take up the role of ruler. So looking for a solution, Socrates, this is again, sort of paraphrasing some quotation from the book, insists that the ruling person would require a special kind of wage, a misthos. At the same time, the dialogue notes that people might come to see paid rulers as money-grubbing mercenaries. So ultimately, the conversation in the Republic revives the possibility of monetary payment, floating it alongside other conventional perks like what Melissa Lane calls the keeping of women for sex, a prerequisite of the powerful in the patriarchal society of the time. When, quote, the Republic trenches not just on a service conception of rule, but on a feature especially, though not always associated with democratic rule, which is wages for guardians, Lane argues it is attempting to compensate for its class-specific ban, that's the guardian ban, on biological families and wealth, which would invite competing forms of alliance and allegiance, patronage, and corruption. And that's my gloss on the implications for Lane of this move in Plato's argument. But what, Lane asks, is Plato doing as a matter of political theorizing in depicting the guardians, quote, living like military mercenaries in encampments while imposing a wage, unquote, on those of them who will rule? This is a good question. And Lane's answer is that it will encourage rulers in the Kallipolis to feel dependent on the wages the ruled provide, without encouraging the ruled to see themselves as, quote, political superiors of their rulers, unquote. So to disincentivize exploitation by the rulers, in other words, the Republic makes wages necessary for ruling, not just for guarding. And Lane's response here understands the question of what Plato might be doing strictly within the internal moves and demands of Socrates' dialogue. But elsewhere in the book, she is alert to the creative ways that Plato's texts do not reject, but use and rework the function and the meaning of contemporaneous Greek institutions, like the misthos or wage. As she puts it, the very idea of a wage for a ruler is an interesting one in the broader Greek context. On the one hand, it would have been simply and widely assumed that both hereditary and non-hereditary rulers enjoyed a myriad of material benefits in virtue of their ruling position. High status political power was simply that kind of good, bringing with it most other earthly goods in turn, unquote. Socrates, however, doesn't take the wage or its meaning as given, as we saw. And he calls it into question, not least of all by asking whether a wage for a ruler should come in the form of money or honor. And Lane's own awareness of what she calls the subtle play the text makes with, quote, distinctions in both military and Athenian constitutional pay, unquote, suggests we might approach the question of what Plato is doing here in another sense, and ask what critical implications the deployment of wages might have had for the Athenian context in which the dialogue is set. So consider, for instance, a striking passage in which Lane says Socrates, quote, sums up the intention, unquote, of the dialogue's proposed laws against private land and necessary property for rulers. Whenever the rulers, quote, come to acquire private land and houses and coined money, unquote, this is Socrates, they will be household managers and farmers instead of guardians, becoming despots and enemies instead of allies of the other citizens, unquote. So Lane eventually concludes that the Kallipolis wage would come in the form of rations, not money, though she acknowledges that rulers will be incorporated problematically into what she calls a monetary economy. Leaving aside this conclusion, I want to draw out a central aspect in the passage that Lane refers to, and that is the danger posed by oikonomia. Etienne Helmers has suggested in a recent book on oikonomia that for Plato, the oikonomic life of the Kallipolis must be managed in a way that contains private interest. Even the best city, he writes, entrusted to the guardianship of philosopher kings or philosopher queens, will also deteriorate as soon as rulers begin to behave like oikonomoi, concerned above all or exclusively with their own private property. So the design for the Kallipolis attempts to counteract this trend, he continues, by drawing a strict division between those who guard the city, the just city, and those who provide wages or food to the guardians. But it ends up placing what he says is the life of the guardians under the sign of an entire community of goods and people. There is a tension in Plato, which Lane also sees, because the Republic does not ignore the economy, as Helmer puts it, but on the contrary, attempts to give it its rightful place in the city so that it works for its unity and community rather than against them. This will break down, of course, which means that we end up confronting, as Melissa just said, the problem of political change, another focal point of her interpretation of the Republic. So I've argued in another context that one lesson of the Republic, which I think fits with what Melissa was just saying, is that no matter how well or prolifically a regime crafts its institutional mechanism or mechanisms, constitutional design is unable to rid political life of its inherent contingency. And that's one of the lessons of the Republic. This does not stop us from asking, it may even invite us to wonder what critical perspectives we're getting on the other regime, the Athenian one, inspiring and backgrounding this lesson. As with the marriage lottery and the myth of the metals, in which Socrates' discussion repurposes notions of ancient Greek kinship by disconnecting it from biological reproduction, wages appear as a valuable stabilizing political tool. They must be uncoupled, however, from the ancient Greek institution of the oikos. So, of course, Aristotle's Politics will go on to claim a link, if not an identification, between an oikonomos, a household manager, and a despot. But it is worth spelling out for our purposes, I think, perhaps how this link depends on the existence of an oikos discourse and a political context in which the oikos carries a particular political and strategic function, how it is headed by a man who is also the master of a family, or a kyrios. For the demos of the Republic's dramatic setting, a male citizen's membership in an oikos, which typically came in the form of guardianship, or kyria, granted access to rule, to democratic rule. Lane's book helps us see that rulers in the Kallipolis will, by contrast, never be oikonomoi in this sense, even though, as the myth of the metals prescribes, they will think of all the members of the polis in filial terms. So the Republic seems to turn the Kallipolis, as many other people have noted, into a sort of giant oikos, rather than simply jettisoning the idea of it altogether. The problem with Athenian democracy, then, is not that rule successfully exits the home for the public spaces of the polis, as is so often claimed, but whether, when the Republic is read, when we read it as a form of immanent critique, the Republic is actually suggesting that democratic rule is always guaranteed by, and therefore impossible to distinguish from, a practice of oikonomia. And that might be where the sort of instability lies. And I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Demi, for those wonderful comments. So it's now my great joy to introduce Anthony Hooper, who is a lecturer in the School of Liberal Arts at the University of Wollongong, and a dear colleague. Prior to joining Wollongong, Anthony was a junior research fellow in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University, a position he took up upon completion of his doctorate in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Sydney. Anthony specializes in ancient philosophy, working particularly on Plato and pre-Socratic philosophy, or in the company of Andre Lax, we must call that early Greek philosophy. His research focuses particularly on intersections between Greek philosophy, poetry, and religion. Anthony's current major research project is a monograph on immortality in Plato's Symposium. There are many advantages to having Anthony as a colleague, and one of them is that he shares his work in progress with me. I've had the privilege of reading drafts of this book, and it's a masterpiece in the making, so one to look out for. You heard it here first. Also worth looking out for is a book he's editing for Cambridge University Press, along with Andre Capra and Sarah Miles. Anthony, did you give me the working title of that?
Yeah, now I've got to remember what it is. Plato and Comedy in the Socratic Dialogues.
Thank you. And already completed is his co-edited book with George Gatzis, Aspects of Death and the Afterlife in Ancient Greece, published by Liverpool University Press in 2021. So please join me in welcoming Anthony.
Well, thanks so much for that over-generous introduction, Tristan, and thank you both to you and Ben for giving me the opportunity to talk, and thank you particularly for Melissa for reasons I won't go into. I was forced for the first time in my life to start having baths, and while an absolutely obnoxious form of ablution, one of the things that did make it at all tolerable was that was just the week when I got my copy of your book, so it absolutely saved me in a psychological sense there. I'll just, given that it's midnight, I'll focus more on reading my comments. So Lane's monograph of Rule and Office sets out to absolve Plato of the old charge that on political matters he proves a naive and even dangerous utopian thinker. His vision of the untrammeled rule of philosopher kings, his accusers declare, barely warrants the name of political theory at all, bespeaking a decidedly adolescent form of social arrangement, falling worryingly short of the sophisticated procedural constitutionalism which is the hallmark of mature polities. Against this conceit, Lane argues, both convincingly and comprehensively, that the political reflections of one of history's greatest thinkers do indeed amount to more than simply crowning philosophers, inviting them to do their thing and hoping for the best. She situates Plato within an established tradition which envisages polities as reliably oriented towards their proper telos, the good of the rule, only when buttressed by an institutional framework, or taxis, which adequately defines its officers, limits its rulers, and imposes processes of accountability. Lane forcefully demonstrates that Plato consistently and dynamically engages with the political arrangements of his day, and so establishes his credential as a genuine political theorist, and one to whom we can and should look for guidance in reforming contemporary constitutional arrangements, which is to say, dialogues like the Republic, Statesmen and Laws represent fertile material for a properly critical antiquities. There are innumerable threads that I'd like to pursue here, but I'll restrict myself to 3, and the first 2 are going to focus particularly on the apparatus of rule set up in the Republic, while the third goes to Plato's political thought more generally. So my first point concerns the status of Plato's constitutional program in the Republic. In her second chapter, Lane characterizes this system of rule as an instance of discursive legislation, legislation in word rather than in deed. Absent the coercive force which attends legislation indeed, Lane envisages Plato's project to be first and foremost exploratory, proposing and testing various arrangements of rule within discrete dialectical circumscriptions. So while Plato does not seek to commend the specific arrangements he articulates perhaps in all seriousness, he models what a properly philosophically grounded constitutional program would look like. And these explorations avoid the charge of utopianism insofar as 1, they're born out of a consistent awareness of and commitment to the demands for checks on rulers, and 2, they aim at practical results, developing proposals which, quote, could eventually in some form come to exist in actuality. Plato's explorations then are not fantastical odysseys, but instances of serious play, involving focused investigations on the forms constitutional checks to power might take. In arguing this way, Lane invites us to conceive of Plato's Callipolis as less of an utopia, a nowhere, and more of an utopia, a bestwhere, and you can feel free to press that comparative construction to your heart's desires. This, at least non-utopian reading, finds succor in at least 2 features of the dialogue. First, in constructing the appropriate taxis of Callipolis, Plato incorporates many of the mechanisms of accountability which would have been entirely familiar to 4th century Athenians. And these include things like the rotation of officers, systems of audit, and the payment of wages, which we've already heard about. And second, the institutional arrangements he articulates are suitably reasoned, carefully explained, and defended against modest critique. And he applies this justificatory procedure all the more vigorously in his more revolutionary suggestions. The foundational institutional arrangements Plato famously envisages in the Republic occur in the proposed, if we don't like obliteration of the oikos, we can say the sort of like ballooning of the oikos to include, the entire state. But while undoubtedly unorthodox, it is not a proposal that would necessarily strike Plato's audience as unprecedented, at least for those with a love of theatre. One of the many reasons to admire Lane's opus is that in addition to bringing to bear an encyclopedic knowledge of ancient and contemporary political theory, she proves keenly aware of Plato's indebtedness to poetry in his political reflections. In particular, Lane identifies the epic vision of rulers as, quote, shepherds of the people, as a rudimentary influence on Platonic and wider Greek conceptions of the character of rulers and the telos of rule. But there's another genre which receives less attention from Lane, but which proves more immediately germane to the discursive legislative project of the Republic, and that is comedy. In sketching the foundational institutional arrangements of rule for his best city, Plato seems impelled to turn to the utopian projects of comedy. Aristophanes' Ecclesiazusei represents the principal inspiration for the taxes of Callipolis, and the resonances here extend beyond the merely stylistic to the substantive. Plato's proposals regarding the abolition of private property, the communization of sexual partners, and the inclusion of women among the ruling class all find precedent in Praxagoras' political project. Now, granted, Plato does voice his anxiety that his proposals will likely appear ridiculous to the ignorant, which could plausibly be interpreted as a distancing maneuver from the comic origins of these arrangements. But I would have more sympathy for this reading if this moment did not also have a direct analogue in the play, where Praxagora expresses similar concerns about these very proposals. So rather than perform its avowed function of detaching Plato's constitutional project from the comic stage, it serves instead to secure this connection. Not only does Plato look to comedy for inspiration for the taxis of Callipolis, he is eager to belabor its comic and utopian credentials. So I feel that my first comment, Melissa, is something that you're already thinking about, given that our comments before you're already preparing for a conference on utopianism in ancient political thought. But I'm very intrigued to what you make of this connection in the Callipolis, and particularly its significance for that, characteristic Popperian critique of Plato as a hopeless utopian. So my second issue goes to the vexing issue of the payment of wages to guardians in Callipolis. So as Lane argues at length in her 6th chapter, which has been distributed, the payment of wages is puzzling given A, in Republic 1, wages are associated with mercenaries, an alien and destructive element within the city. B, the wages of the guardians on Callipolis assume an unconventional, indeed decidedly porcine form, consisting in bread and board for the guardian class, rather than in coin or treasure. C, the language of wages is peculiar, as guardians are required to refer to the working class as paymasters, but the inverse does not hold, with workers being required to refer to guardians not as wage workers, but as rulers. And D, the conventional logic of wages simply does not apply here. The paymasters have no previously held political power to delegate to the guardians, nor does any coercive power emerge from their payment of wages. So Lane proposes an elegant 3-step solution in which he argues, first, Plato identifies the wages as an indispensable means of preserving relational dependence between a people and their rulers. Second, it is necessary for Plato to transform the wage system in light of the obliteration of private property for the ruling class. And third, while assuming a radically distinct character from wages conventionally understood, Plato preserves the language of wages in order to impress a service conception of rule upon the rulers. So while I think that this solution holds considerable purchase, I wonder whether we can account for the full peculiarities of this account of wages by looking at their operation in respect to the guardian class alone. So my initial concerns are, one, and I think Demetra pointed this out really well, that the language of wages appear entirely inapposite to the thumoedic character of the auxiliary class, who see the world instead through the lens of honor. And two, there is an alternative model of service rule, which, at least to my mind, better captures this concern and is more befitting of Plato's overall political project. It is the arrangement which underpins the societies of the Homeric epics and articulated most forcefully in the famous exchange between Sarpedon and Glaucus at Iliad 12, 307-28. Here, Sarpedon outlines the arrangement which holds between kings and their people, in which rulers are granted valuables, lands, livestock, and livery, in exchange for fighting in defense of their people. But these valuables are not so much given or received as property, but rather as material honors. And despite the language of exchange Sarpedon employs in this passage, what emerges here is not a quid pro quo in which people pay their rulers for protection, but a context of spontaneous generosity in which different parties lend their differing capacities towards the good of the overall community. It seems peculiar to me then that Plato frames the exchange between guardians and workers in terms of wages rather than in terms of material honours. Now, we might of course question whether Plato is even familiar with the concept of material honours. His tin-eared depiction of Achilles in Republic 2 as a money lover serves as prima facie evidence that Plato does not. But Plato's account of the degradation of aristocratic to timocratic constitutions manifests a sophisticated appreciation of this system, to my mind. On his account, the aristocratic man gives way to the timocratic when he stops valuing material goods as material honours and starts to value them as such, i.e. as property. So why then does Plato describe the arrangement between workers and rulers in terms of wages rather than in terms of honours and particularly material honours? To my mind, in order to do so, we have to look at the operation of the arrangement in terms of the relation between two classes. So in terms of an exchange between two classes who, while both bent towards the common good, conceive of this good in radically different ways. For Homer, all people conceive of the good in terms of honour, but in Callipolis, Plato envisages such a framework to be embraced by auxiliaries alone. By contrast, the language of wages is natural to the working class. That's how they think about the world. I wonder then whether the peculiarities regarding the language of honours emerges in the exchange between two classes of people who deal in different currencies of the good, but who are attempting nevertheless to gesture towards the worldview of the other insofar as they can. So my second question for Melissa is this. What does she make of sort of like my quite underdeveloped suggestion that the peculiar situation regarding wages speaks to an imperfect attempt between two classes of people to communicate with each other from radically distinct sort of vocabularies of value? And for my final comment, which is very brief, I widen my focus to Plato's political project in general. In establishing Plato's commitment to constitutional proceduralism, Lane has established him as a genuine political theorist. But I wonder whether in securing Plato's political credentials, we open him to a worse charge. From the perspective of the 21st century liberal, there is much to find objectionable in Plato's political visions. So taking for one example, the myth of metals in Republic 2, the foundational fiction for his ideal society, which posits naturally differentiated classes according to hierarchically arranged categories, making some prone to rule and others prone to be ruled. From the perspective of the liberal critic with whom I started, the idea of naturally differentiated classes is liable to the charge of worrying utopianism. But to furnish this suggestion with complex constitutional arrangements which serve to institute and preserve such a division risks the greater accusation of Foucauldian dystopianism. So my final question then is this. In establishing his fundamental interest in the taxis of rule, we redeem Plato for the academy, but do we damn him as an appropriate influence in a critical project? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Anthony. Melissa.
Great. Well, thank you both for those really thought-provoking comments. They're wonderful to think with, and I think raise issues that are really fundamental to the book and to how we might take political thought about Plato going forward. Let me start with Demi's comments and connect those to Anthony's comments on wages, and then I'll come back to Anthony's other two comments. So in thinking about the place of wages in the Republic, let me say, first of all, that I would want to agree with, I think, Demi's illuminating closing suggestion that we can read Plato as challenging the fundamental way in which Athenian democratic rule depended on a certain conception of oikonomia, and specifically on the distinction between a particular kind of distinction between the oikos and the polis. And I think that broadly speaking, Antony's kind of engagement with the problematic of wages, and in many ways, the chapter is really meant to say, this is a problem in the dialogue. And it's true that I offer a kind of solution, but I think that in a way, what Antony is doing is deepening our understanding of the problem and why this is such a complex issue in the dialogue. And it's surprising to me that it's not one on which more attention has really focused hitherto. I would say that kind of as a general point about the reading Plato in light of Athens in response to Demi's comments, I think it's absolutely right that what Plato wants to do in the Republic, I argue, is that it's important that rulers shouldn't become, as she focused on that passage 417a to b, household managers as opposed to rulers. And so they have to be deprived of any possibility structurally, legally, kind of institutionally, that they could so pursue the private rather than the public. And it's interesting that even in Plato's other works, so you might think in the Laws, whereas Andre's important recent book on the Laws has shown us that Plato is vindicating some value for ta idion there in an important way that is distinct here from the Republic. But even there, as Etienne Helmer indeed showed in his early work, the language of the household is no longer uniquely that of the oikos, but that of the kleros. It's a kind of division from above. So rather than the oikos being the pre-political building block to which the polis has to accommodate itself in the Laws, yes, there is a property holding and people who are, as it were, household managers and property managers, but that property holding is assigned by the city. And actually, in light of Demi's move to Oxbridge, it's interesting to note that this is the difference between the Oxbridge colleges, which predate the university, and I was an undergraduate at Harvard, the Harvard houses, where the houses are simply an administrative subdivision of the university, created by the university with no pre-existing holdings. So even there, you might say, even in the Laws, Plato is still suspicious of that sort of foundational power of the oikos. And I think that Demi's comments kind of bring that out very well. They also, well, I would make maybe two further comments in response to Demi. One is, there's a very interesting book, I don't know if people have yet seen it, by Naomi Campa on freedom and power in classical Athens. And she has a very interesting discussion of how we can understand the term hakirios in light of emphasizing the role of the kyrios of the oikos in Athens. So she wants to build the political understanding of the kyrios from that. And I think it's a very powerful reading. And finally, I would just say that it's interesting to think about Xenophon's Economia, where in book 9 or chapter 9, verse passages 14 to 15, Ischomachus's wife, Ischomachus discusses that he is going to set his wife in the position of guardian of the laws, just as in cities, the citizens choose guardian of the laws who act as overseers, commending the law abiding. So what's interesting to me about that passage is that that's really what I think Plato is doing in the political realm, saying we need guardians of the laws, actually in the Republic as well as in the Laws, and even the statesmen who can take on the safeguarding role. So there we have a kind of parallel between a way that the oikos can function and a way that the polis can function. So I don't think that it's necessarily that it's only, well, anyway, that maybe gives us some further grounds for discussion. In terms of Antony's comments on the oikos, I'm actually very sympathetic to your idea that there's a kind of disjunctive understanding of value that we find in the two different classes. And I think that's actually broadly, I think it could be incorporated into my reading in some way. I think the one thing I would say about that is that it's not clear to me that the language of honors is entirely alien, even to the guardian class. So there's the important passage in book 7 where it said the sort of final answer to Adeimantus's critique that the guardians won't be happy and that the city isn't designed to make them happy is that actually, well, they will be, because they will get honors in the city. So actually the language of honor, I would say, is actually recuperated. And so rather than perhaps being in tension with the non-monetary language, but the idea of avoiding a quid pro quo is very congenial to my reading. So I think there's grounds for us to interact. To leave some time for discussion, let me be brief in answering Antony's 2 other very challenging comments. So one is, absolutely, I think you're right that I need to say more about the Ecclesia Zeusai and comedy. In my book on the Statesman, I do have an extensive reading of the Statesman in comparison to the Lysistrata, but I didn't do that in this book for the Ecclesia Zeusai, and you're right that I should. I guess my general response would be that I take seriously the passages where Socrates says, you know, we have to reformulate our idea of what's ridiculous. So this kind of thing might seem ridiculous, but actually it's not ridiculous. It's in fact the key to political order are these dimensions of the taxis that you highlighted. That would be the sort of general outline of my reading, but you're absolutely right that I need to give it. And your final point is extremely challenging. And this is absolutely the point. So this is the point that we can redeem, as you put it, the taxis of rule in the academy by saying, look, Plato is a constitutional thinker in terms of the vocabulary and roles of constitutional thought and practice in his time. But does that sort of disqualify him for any kind of political project? I would say about the myth of the metals that, of course, there are many ways to read it, and Demes herself has offered a sort of less foundationalist way of reading it. I have not offered any real way of reading it at all, so I think that's a fair challenge to my reading. But again, I guess I guess my project is sort of, I would ultimately be okay if it's only recuperative in part, you know, so if parts of Plato's thought can help us with our own constitutional dilemmas, I think that's okay, even if we have to jettison other parts, because we're not trying to show that his whole project can succeed. That's not my aim. It's rather to show how we can highlight certain challenges by understanding the interdependence of taxis and telos and the need for any kind of order of offices to have an overall safeguarding function. So thank you again both very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, I might take over from Tristan at this point and manage the question time. In accordance with our usual practice, you can either raise your hand, as Andre has done, and I will throw to you in a second, Andre. But if you would like, you can also place the letter Q in the chat, and I can place you in a queue. And if you would prefer, you can also write your question in the chat, and I can read it out if you're uncomfortable addressing the group directly. So, Andre, with no further ado, let's throw to your question.
Thank you to everybody. So, and to Melissa, of course. So I will start with actually your last point about parting. So the political works according to one's point of view, so to speak, and one interest. So I've tried to deal with that question with distinguishing between Plato's principle and their incorporation or application, or whatever he does with those principles, and trying to say that Plato's principles are indeed valuable for us to think in modern terms about political problems. So I just want to ask you whether you would agree with this distinction, framing your parting things that are interesting and things that are living and things that are dead, with this distinction between principles and and application. I missed the right word. So I have four other remarks, which I will make very briefly because they are very general questions. And I have something to say about the wages too, but this implies translations and detailed problems that are not probably adequate for this, but I will write to you about this. So the general points are the following. I think you are right. Yeah, I think we can describe your book as insisting on the continuity between Republic, politicus, statesmen, and laws rather than on changes. Now, I fully agree with that. That's the yes part, the yes part of it. And now is the no part. The no part comes from, in some sense, Plato's text itself, because Plato says in the laws, we have a first city, we have a second city. And by all continuities, which are not, to be negated at all, denied at all, there is a change. And so I wonder, I'm sorry, I just reread the two chapters that you sent. I don't remember exactly what you say about the other part, but I would like you to say something about the relationship between continuity and break, position of one theory and revising and so on. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is really what is modernity, modern political discourse. And so your framework is constitutionalism. And that's fine, and that's interesting, and so on. But there is also belonging to the modern, let's say, problematic. You can call that continental, and it's perhaps more continental than it is Anglo-Saxon. But that's a question too. Is not constitutionalism, but the problem of constitutionalism, and that is linked with what people call the theological political predicament. So, as you know, the first word of the laws is God. There has been a lot of thinking and fuss about it. There is the fuss, but there is also the seriousness of the question. So, what does God play in your account? And this is linked to, the status of the philosopher, the whole talk about what it is to be obedient to what, in what sense, and so on. So. The second question: what does theology plays? What is the role of theology in the constitutional perspective? Third point: accountability. This is extremely interesting. What you say about Didonai, the two uses of Didonai logon. But then the question is this an analogy? Or is this a would-be identity? Because if it is a would-be identity, Didonai logon, this is the task of the philosopher. And this is not a question of office. This is not a question of rule, or perhaps it's a question of rule, but it's not a question of office. And so what is the relationship, the exact relationship that you establish between the two expressions, the two formula, logon Didonai? What is the relationship? And this has to do with the role of what you call the daily meeting. This is a wonderful expression, although it's okay. Because the daily meeting, as you say, I think, is not an office. So what is it? Are these philosophers? Yes and no. They are not philosophers because they are former office holders, but they are philosophers because they don't know anything about the unity of virtues, or at least are still looking for a solution about this difficulty. So what is their role? And then the last point is shepherd. So that is also a part of the continental discussion. Foucault has written stupidities about this because he has Oriental and West and East, so to speak. And but there is an internal criticism of shepherdism in the Politicus, as you know, and the relationship between shepherd on the Chronos and our cities. So what do you make exactly of shepherd, the shepherd thing, which has all, of course, also something to do with Book 1 of the Republic. So these were the large questions.
Thank you so much, Andre. And it's wonderful to be in dialogue with you again about this, as we were when we were both kind of working on our respective most recent books. There's a lot in what you say. I won't try to maybe address absolutely all of it, but let me do my best. So first of all, let me say some general things about the kind of structure and framework. So picking up the question about principles and application and the relationship among the three dialogues. So I think probably in broad terms, we agree about the idea of principles versus application. I've shied away from that language a bit because I think it suggests this idea of sort of blueprints that only have to be, applied, and that the purpose is to give a blueprint which will then be applied as much as possible. And of course, then we get into all the very subtle questions about the meaning of possibility in Book 5 of the Republic, as well as the first, second, third city question in the laws. In the book, as you know, I thought that it might be a more flexible approach to think about reconfiguration. So I use this language of models and reconfigurations. And the reconfigurations are reconfigurations of existing roles and vocabularies into discrete models that combine a certain taxis with a certain conception of the telos. Again, in broad terms, the telos has to be it has to be the good of the ruled, but you can fill that out in different ways and to different degrees of specificity. And so what I liked about this was that as I thought Antony's comments brought out very well, this highlights the sense in which I want to read each of the dialogues as a kind of venture or exploration with this set of interlocutors, with this set of sort of initial conditions. Let's work up this model and test it against our basic goals of finding a taxis that's adequate to the telos. But again, as he also brought out, if we read this as discursive legislation, then there's a kind of further question about, well, how could it ever be implemented? And maybe that's the point at which we ask the question about application. But even just remaining at the level of the models, I think it gives us this ability to kind of think in these flexible terms. So that was the approach that I was taking. I don't think it's inconsistent with your approach, but it's, just perhaps introducing a different sort of machinery. In terms of republic, statesmen, laws, agreements, and disagreements, I mean, in many ways, you're right. I think while my view is complementarian, I am emphasizing the continuities in this book, whereas in my earliest book on the statesman, I was emphasizing contrast between the republic and the statesman. So that is a kind of evolution in my thinking and approach. I guess, well, maybe this is what I will say. I don't necessarily think I can get into everything about the laws that you asked here now, but maybe the broad thing I would say is that I do recognize and would take seriously that the laws, is a model that's operating on different founding assumptions. It is the second city. It's the city for mortals rather than demigods, or children of gods and heroes. It's not the city for heroes. And, Ta'idian is important, although as I discussed, we have to interpret that, in very specific ways. It's the kleros, not the oikos, and so on. The most important thing that I would say about the laws, maybe, and this answers your question to some extent about the God in the laws, is, and maybe also the philosophers, question, and the daily meeting is what I call the nocturnal council, for those who don't know, and what Andre calls in his latest book, The Watch. What I want to emphasize is that there, in all three dialogues, we have this juvenile problem, which is the problem of how to guard the guardians, what safeguards the guardians, and what safeguards the office holders. So the office holders can never safeguard themselves. You always need some higher thing to safeguard them. In the Republic, that's the philosopher rulers who are not office holders, but were office holders and are now safeguarding through their practice of philosophy and accountability, but also through exercising the supervision of the education and the selection, which is crucial to their function. In the statesman, the safeguarding is provided through the statesman, but also through the offices and laws that they may set up. So we have that structure there also. And in the laws, the safeguarding is carried out through the laws themselves, which incorporate the divine understanding of what is truly good, and the watch or the daily meeting or the nocturnal council, which exists to safeguard the spirit of the laws, so far as that is possible. But the emphasis on the safeguarding in the laws, the dialogue, the laws, comes from the laws themselves incorporating this kind of divinely understood nous. So that's my sort of basic understanding of how the laws function. Yeah, let me leave it there. I think we can talk about shepherding another time.
Tristan, do you have a question?
I do. Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed listening to this discussion. I fear my question may not come out in the most clear way as I'm start to fade, but anyway, I'll do my best. So, Melissa, reading the first chapter of your book, I was particularly drawn to the brief discussion that you have of Sheldon Wolin and then Hannah Arendt and Jacques Rancière, who kind of all in some respects are trying to accuse Plato and this tradition of ancient political thought of something pretty similar. To take up Wollin's distinction, for instance, between constitutional democracy and democratic constitutionalism, that being this a difference between a kind of entrenching of officers and political rulers in ways that might completely erode the kind of service principle or the service function that you call in the book, against this distinctly ancient democratic activity of, or I guess arrangement of democratic constitutionalism that kind of undoes the institutionalizing effects of politics. And I see your work, and you say that you are kind of challenging this account insofar as it says Plato is just all about constitutional democracy, and this kind of attempt to concretize in a certain way rule and take away that which the 5th century democracy had kind of instituted through saltation or whatever. So I think you do that rightly. It's right to do that as a project in the first place, and that you do it extremely convincingly, for sure. But I guess I wanted to ask you about the kind of distinction itself. So irrespective of where Plato sits with the distinction and where we might put him, I guess I was interested in what you think of that distinction as a whole. And I think that's particularly important for then addressing the question of what critical work Plato is doing for us. But that's kind of part of I guess, a second question that depends a little bit on how you answer the first. So I'll leave it there and hope that makes sense.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tristan. and it's a very well formulated question, despite it being 12:30 at night for you. So thank you. Yeah, so your question makes me think that I should have maybe devoted more time to Wolin, distinct from Arendt and Rancière in the introduction. I kind of lumped them all together. And I think there's more to say probably about, or it's what one can say that Arendt and Rancière are closer in both thinking that rule is antithetical to democracy. And that's really what I want to criticize. And I do have a footnote saying, Wolin is valorizing rule more. He does depart from Arendt in that way. And I think that he recognizes the constitutional parameters of office holding in Athens. So I think my difference from Wolin is maybe more a difference of emphasis rather than, I don't know that I would kind of reject his distinction so much as kind of, I want to emphasize that rule is important, constitutional order is important for democracy, even if you want to have active democratic politics. And I think he wants to emphasize the active democratic politics, but I think it's probably more a question of emphasis, actually. And I think I do have a footnote that sort of does justice to that feature of his thought. But the sort of broader question with Arendt and Rancière is that it's arguable that I'm too influenced by Plato here and the kind of lessons that I take away from reading Plato, but I do take seriously, I think, Plato's the account in Republic 8 that democracy itself, and I think the Athenians themselves actually did recognize this, and so that democracy itself requires offices, it requires laws, it requires legal procedures, it requires accountability. And if those things start to deteriorate in terms of it to become what I call in my reading of Republic 8 shadow play, meaning that, well, notionally we have these laws and offices, but actually we don't really abide by them. We don't make people follow them. We don't enforce them. We don't actually, democracy itself cannot really survive that sort of lack of respect for office and office rule and law. And I think that, Republic 8 is a caricature of the democracy if you read it as saying that's what democracy itself is always like, that it's not respecting that. But I read it more as Plato is saying, this is what happens as democracy degenerates into tyranny. It loses its respect for those things. And I think there's a lot to be said for that point. I think that when we see office holders not being willing to enforce laws and, people wanting to hold office even when they're not entitled to hold office anymore, those sorts of violations actually do undermine the actual project of democracy. And I think the Athenians knew that. So that's in a way a place where I think Plato is actually more sensitive to the real structures of political life in his own time and recognizes what they really are. And it's our idealization or sort of our desire to see Athenian democracy is more antinomian than it actually was, that I think is actually what's getting things wrong there. So I think that's where I would come out.
Thank you.
Well, we're coming up to the half hour, and it doesn't appear that there are any more questions. I'm resisting my natural tendency to embark on an entirely new line of thought and thinking, especially in the wake of Anthony's provocative introduction of the Sarpedon and Glaucus episode from book 12. And there are all sorts of fascinating ramifications that are spinning in my mind out of all of this discussion, not least whether or not Plato's entire project is a response to the autonomization of the oikos across the course of the 5th and early 4th century. But that, I think, is going to have to wait for another forum and another discussion. With Tristan's permission, I think we might wrap it up at this point, and thank, above all, Melissa once again, and thank Demi and Anthony for being such wonderful, generous discussants. And also, in my capacity as a co-director, I want to thank Tristan too for doing the lion's share of the organisation of this particular session, and so thank him as well. And of course, to thank all of our wonderful friends of the Critical Antiquities Network for joining us from all around the world. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. And as we trundle off into the witching hour ourselves here in Sydney, and farewell from us. Farewell
Thank
from
you
the
all.
7th. Farewell from the 7th of August, in fact.
Thank you all so much. It was wonderful. Thank you all. Great to see people and to meet people. And very much appreciate it.